man casually unbuttoned his shirt, declaring it was time for their nightly ritual. By now, Teriella should be used to this, but her heart still pounded like a drum the moment she saw him like that. Then, right on cue, his black hair shimmered into silver. Yep, this strange transformation happened every night. Terry braced herself, saying she was ready, though her shaky hands reaching for his bare chest told a different story. He noticed, of course. Smiling, he gently guided her hand, half teasing, half reassuring. Meanwhile, Terry was internally screaming. Why must she go through this weird routine every night? Her sanity was hanging by a thread. But before your brain joins hers in confusion, let's rewind a bit. How on earth did this bizarre setup even begin? Ever since she was a child, Teriella's mother drilled one belief into her heart: never bow to fate. As long as Terry kept breathing, her dreams would one day come true. Her mother used to say that Terry's path would be lined with flowers in the end, sweet words that became her final goodbye. Now a grown woman, Terry stood before her father, the king of Ruffian, only to be hit with a declaration. She was to travel to the Leonharda Empire as a candidate for the Empress's seat. Terry didn't even hesitate. She respectfully declined. But deep down, she had a sinking feeling her late mother had somehow foreseen this moment. Because the first time the king saw his daughter in years, he treated her more like a pawn than family. In true deadbeat fashion, the king didn't even flinch at her refusal. Instead, he launched into a cold, strategic speech. The sea routes were blocked, plague spread like wildfire, and the kingdom was hanging by a thread. They needed this alliance, and Terry was the offering. Like it or not, she'd be leaving soon, and the journey would take 2 full months. The king made it painfully clear he no longer believed in the prophecy about a divine maiden bringing salvation. Now, he was betting everything on a marriage contract. Terry, understandably frustrated, reminded him that he had other daughters. Why did it have to be her? But the king simply told her to turn around. Behind her were the walking consequences of Terry's colorful family history. One sister had a broken arm. One brother limped with a busted leg. The youngest sister? A scar on her debut-ready face. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Every single injury was Terry's fault. Technically, she wasn't wrong. The older sister had tried to push her down the stairs, and Terry simply grabbed her arm in defense. They both fell. Classic case of karma. As for the brother, he tried to kick her. Terry, like any sensible victim, grabbed the nearest chair to shield herself. Unfortunately, his foot met the furniture instead. Oops. Now the youngest sister, well, that was a circus. She tried to whip Terry like some spoiled villainess in training, only to strike herself in the face. Terry walked away spotless, the little sister left with a scar and tears. Ah yes, truly a loving family. The youngest now sobbed dramatically, and the older sister promised to find the continent's best disguise expert to cover the scar. Terry, watching the scene unfold, thought she probably could heal it with her hidden powers. But honestly, she didn't care enough to try. Especially not for a brat who started the whole thing. Naturally, the king exploded. How could all her siblings be so badly hurt while she stood there without a scratch? Easy answer. No one, not her father, not her siblings, knew that Terry possessed a power she kept hidden all her life. So instead, she played dumb. Terry shrugged and said she was standing right there, wasn't she? Still alive. Much to her family's disappointment. And maybe they all secretly wished she'd disappeared by now. That last line struck a nerve. Furious, the king hurled an ink bottle at her and shouted that this wasn't up for debate. He had promised a princess to the empire, and he intended to deliver. Terry wasn't surprised. She was the royal family's unwanted spare, the forgotten daughter, the scapegoat of every family disaster. Well, almost everyone. There was one person who loved her unconditionally. Her older half-brother Karajan, heir to the throne and son of the queen, the only one who truly saw her as family. So, Terry fired back. She wondered aloud how Karajan would feel if he learned she was being shipped off without a word. After all, he adored her. But the king had already taken care of that problem. Karajan had been sent away to investigate the plague just days ago. The moment he was out of sight, the king launched his plan. No protector. No witnesses. Just Terry and the wolves. Now as for her groom, oh what a treat. The Emperor of Leonharta was infamous. He allegedly butchered half his vassals the moment he took the throne. Rumor had it, he drank himself into oblivion every night, locking himself away in his bedchamber until he couldn't tell the floor from the sky. When urged to marry, he personally inspected the fairest debutantes of the empire, only to reject every single one. Some said it wasn't their looks, but that none caught his eye, or maybe he just enjoyed watching them squirm. Even more chilling, this emperor wasn't born to rule. He was the concubine's son who slaughtered all his siblings to steal the crown. A bloodthirsty tyrant. A drunkard. Possibly worse, and Terry was supposed to marry that? Hard pass. But in the eyes of her very loving family, that kind of man was perfect for Terry. Because to them, her only value was her beauty, a trait inherited from her mother, and now, a tool to be used. She finally asked the obvious. Was the king just trying to get rid of her? The king didn't even bother replying. Terry's older sister did it for him, openly admitting that this marriage would save them the trouble of killing her off. She even reminded Terry that she was supposed to die as a child, but her own mother, through endless effort, kept her alive. Back then, Terry had been only 6 when a terrible illness nearly claimed her life. Her mother traveled across nations for a cure, fought tooth and nail to save her, and succeeded. The only catch? Terry remembered none of it. Even so, she vowed to survive, no matter what fate threw her way. But this time, it felt like fate had her cornered. Before she could protest, the king snapped his fingers, and guards grabbed her by both arms. That was it. Decision made. The snake won this round. Fast forward, after 3 exhausting months, not 2, thanks Dad, she finally arrived in Leonharta. Her transport? A disaster. Broken wagons, half-starved horses. She looked like someone smuggled in a crate. But no turning back now. She heard the stories. Dozens of noblewomen and foreign princesses had chased the empress seat, only to be rejected and sent packing. Terry didn't expect any different. Honestly, she preferred it. A quick rejection would be her ticket to freedom. After all, the empire was vast. Plenty of room to disappear. Because if she got sent back empty-handed, the king would definitely pawn her off again, maybe to someone even worse. Terry's plan was simple. Get rejected, vanish, and never look back. And just as she braced herself for disappointment, footsteps were heard nearby. There he was, walking straight toward her. Emperor Rievenfeld von Leonharta. With a polite bow of her head, Teriella introduced herself as a princess of the kingdom of Ruffion. She kept her tone formal and steady, but on the inside, she was spiraling. Of all people, she never imagined the emperor himself would come out to greet her. Trying to stay composed, she raised her gaze to meet his. And that's when it happened. The emperor's piercing stare shifted without warning. His cold expression melted into something far more intense, before leaning in and announcing, without hesitation, that he had finally found her. And just like that, he declared she would become his bride. She stood frozen, hoping maybe she misheard, or that he was joking. Or perhaps she had hallucinated the whole thing thanks to 3 months in a splintered wagon. But no such luck. Because right after those devastating words, the emperor turned to his aide, Zelim, and told him to begin preparations for the wedding. Zelim, ever efficient, proposed the soonest date available. But Rievenfeld wanted more. This wasn't some forgettable union. This was his empress. He insisted on summoning the supreme priest and picking the most auspicious date possible. Translation: as soon as humanly possible. Meanwhile, Terry just stood there, inwardly screaming. She hadn't even processed the room assignment, and they were already discussing flowers and ceremony robes. Her thoughts about him being the worst husband candidate on the continent, only growing stronger by the second. Desperate to push back, Terry tried to raise an objection, only for the emperor to remind her, pointed yet politely, that she had arrived as an empress candidate. With that, Rievenfeld instructed Zelim to prepare a room for her in the main palace. Since it wasn't ready yet, she'd stay in the imperial guest suite, an area usually reserved for visiting royalty. At the very least, he was offering better hospitality than her own family ever had. But the emperor's attention wasn't done burning holes into her. His sharp eyes fell on her tiny, sad-looking luggage. With a bemused look, he noted that she must have rushed to see him right after arriving. Clearly, she had been that eager. Wrong. But she wasn't about to admit she was expecting a speedy rejection, and had planned to flee immediately after. Then came the worst part. He brought up her carriage. The rickety thing she'd arrived in looked more like a potato cart than royal transport. He casually asked if Ruffion had fallen on hard times, earning a polite denial from Zelim. Still, the emperor wasn't done twisting the knife. He wondered aloud if perhaps her luggage had been swapped with a peasant's belongings by mistake. It was that worn down. Terry flushed with embarrassment, mentally cursing her useless family. If they were going to auction her off, couldn't they at least have thrown in some decent baggage? She worried that her shabby appearance might offend the Emperor, that he might take it as an insult. Judging by the way his gaze darkened slightly, she wasn't entirely wrong, but maybe not the reason she thought. Panic kicked in. Terry, desperate to change the subject, quickly asked for directions to the guest suite. Time to make a strategic retreat. Thankfully, the palace staff wasted no time, leading her to the imperial guest rooms. The moment she stepped inside, she felt like she had walked into a dream. Plush furnishings, soft lighting, more elegance and great staff service than she'd ever known. It was a world far removed from the chaos of her kingdom. For a moment, she was almost swept away. If this was what life as an empress looked like, she could understand why others chased the title. It was bliss. But sadly, bliss wasn't enough. She reminded herself that no amount of velvet cushions could justify marrying a known tyrant. Just then, a voice interrupted her thoughts. A calm, male voice, smooth and teasing. The Emperor had apparently followed her, and was now speculating on her very obvious internal crisis. From the look on her face, he assumed she might be plotting an escape. He wasn't wrong. Terry instincts immediately assumed blackmail was next, that he'd threaten Ruffian to keep her in line. But to her surprise, that wasn't where he was going. Instead, the Emperor simply noted that judging by her sad excuse for a carriage, the worn dress, and the battered luggage, it didn't look like she had much reason to miss her homeland at all. And in truth, it wasn't her kingdom's future he was concerned about. It was hers. A veil of clouds briefly swept across the moon, casting shadows over the Emperor's face. In that dim light, his expression became unreadable, and Terry, already overwhelmed, had no idea what thoughts might be running through his mind as he settled quietly. Terry's heart sank. If the temple ever uncovered the truth, if they realized that the prophesied one they'd been waiting for was standing here in this very palace, it wouldn't be a blessing. It would be a death sentence for her. And now it was clear why no injury, no matter how cruel, could ever leave a lasting mark. Terry wasn't just lucky. She was the Divine Maiden. For someone who had spent her entire life hiding that secret, she instinctively reached for the oldest trick in the book, denial. Maybe she could pass it off as a mistake, say the Emperor was wrong, but Rievenfell wasn't buying it. He coolly called out her bluff, labeling it a poor excuse wrapped in panic. He reminded her of the state of the world. 2 decades had passed since the death of the World Tree, the source of life itself. Since then, the continent had plunged into chaos. Plagues swept through the land. Crops withered. Droughts and floods traded turns like clockwork, either starving people or drowning them. Wildfires scorched the forests, driving beasts into desperate frenzies. The seas? No better. Ships sank like stones, and trade routes vanished beneath violent waves. And so, with despair gripping every corner of the continent, the people had turned to prophecy. They believed the Divine Maiden was the last gift from their god, Semiula. Some even believed that salvation would only come once she was returned to the heavens as an offering. In other words, Terry wasn't a savior in their eyes. She was a sacrifice. The realization sent a chill through her spine. Her fists clenched as panic churned in her chest. How had the Emperor found out? She had been so careful. Her mother had warned her over and over. Never let anyone find out. One glance at Rievenfell's golden eyes, though, told her this wasn't speculation. He knew, and he wasn't guessing. Still, she clung to denial, but the Emperor simply raised the stakes. He pointed out that he had the high priest at his command. Unlike her kingdom, where the temple was distant and untouchable, the Leonharda Empire had the highest-ranking clergy within arm's reach, and if he wanted, that priest could confirm everything within minutes. Cornered, Terry dropped the act. She stopped pretending and went on the offensive. She asked if he was threatening her now. The Emperor only chuckled. He said it wasn't a threat, just a potential outcome. And besides, if he really meant to expose her, wouldn't he have summoned the high priest already? Quite the opposite. Then, as he stepped closer, something strange happened. The black-haired Emperor seemed to shimmer, and silver strands replaced the darkness. His entire look changed right before her eyes. And then he began unbuttoning his shirt, One moment they were discussing divine secrets, and the next he was half undressed. Was this what he wanted her power for? A scandalous miracle? Her face burned bright red as she gawked at his bare chest. Rievenfell smirked, clearly enjoying her shocked reaction. He gently guided her trembling hand to his chest, adding, not so subtly, that he preferred to keep her close, very close. Still battling internal chaos, and maybe a tiny bit of uninvited fantasy, Terry finally noticed something strange on his skin. A mark, carved like a tangle of tree roots right over his heart. That mark wasn't just a scar, it was a seal. Suddenly, the pieces began falling into place. After the world tree perished, the world spiraled into decay. In response, an alchemist named Generva had committed the unthinkable. In a desperate effort to create a new tree, he had extracted resin from the dead one and injected it into human bodies. The result? The infamous Ferdiac experiment. Pure human experimentation masked as salvation. But those experiments ended in tragedy. The moment the resin entered someone's body, their life force began to drain away. Bodies shriveled, skin cracked like dying bark, and the seal was all that stood between life and death. Eventually, every test subject died. Generva vanished, hunted across the land, his name blacklisted by the continent itself. And the only known survivor? Emperor Rievenfell. Every test subject and follower of Generva had been sentenced to death. It was part of the peace treaty that ended the continent's chaos. The very treaty Rievenfell had helped Finalorge as a crown prince. Leaning in close, his voice dropped low. Now that they both held each other's secrets, there was no room left for suspicion. He asked her to show him her power. She tried. With both palms pressed to his chest, she concentrated, but nothing happened. The moment dragged, awkward. From his end, it almost looked like she was trying to shove him away. For a second, he even thought she was trying to bolt. So naturally, he pulled her into his arms. Right then, it happened. A golden light bloomed between them, surrounding them like a warm, radiant glow. It was quick, and when it faded, his silver hair had returned to black. That was all the proof he needed. Rievenfell made it very clear. He had no intention of revealing her divine powers to anyone. Instead, he would guard her secret, so long as her power remained his and only his. News of the Emperor's impending marriage was spreading like wildfire throughout the Empire. Rumors churned in every corridor, but this time, the whispers came with receipts. Servants confirmed that Zelim, the Emperor's aide, had been overheard making arrangements, discussing which dignitaries to invite to the royal wedding. Even more surprising, word had it, the Emperor was so smitten with his bride-to-be, Princess Teriella, that he allowed only her personal maids into her chamber. Honestly, most folks believed it. After all, Teriella's beauty was practically divine. But while the Empire buzzed over this picture-perfect royal romance, the future Empress herself was sulking hard in her room, looking like she'd lost a war. She wasn't crying over cold feet or butterflies. She was distraught because Zelim had done too good a job. Wedding bells weren't just on the horizon, they were ringing full volume. And her fiancé? Oh, he wasn't holding back. The Emperor had showered Terry with an absurd amount of extravagant gifts, elevated her to use the former Empress's chambers, and, most jaw-dropping of all, granted her the Damask Palace. Now, that wasn't just any palace. It sat beneath the remnants of the World Tree itself, one of the rare places still touched by divine energy. No Empress had ever been gifted the Damask Palace before. Rievenfell wasn't just being generous. He was rewriting imperial history. So, why was Terry still furiously punching her bed like it was a personal hobby? Well, she was trapped in the main palace, her room inconveniently located right next to his. Of course, she was grateful. Deeply, actually. For once, she was being treated like actual royalty instead of the neglected scapegoat back home. But that was precisely the problem. The more kindness she received, the more terrified she became of losing it all, and going back to a life of hunger and cruelty. Trying to shake off the unease, Terry recalled her past conversation with the Emperor. She had been shocked to learn he was a survivor of the Ferdiac experiment. After all, no test subject had ever lived to tell the tale, or so she thought. Rievenfell explained it had happened a long time ago, back when he was still crown prince. No one knew because no one was supposed to know. Terry's stare must have been intense because the Emperor chuckled and told her not to look so concerned. He wasn't a ghost just yet. He even admitted that while her divine touch had helped him recover, it wasn't a permanent cure. The seal would return. His hair would turn silver again, which meant they'd need to repeat their nightly ritual from now on. Naturally, she began wondering how he had hidden this from the world for so long. His answer? Simple. He had weaponized his worst rumors. The image of a drunk, reclusive ruler became his shield. He'd stagger through court gossip as a supposed alcoholic to keep prying eyes away. Back when he was still a prince, no one cared about him. But once he wore the crown, the same people who ignored him couldn't stop watching. And Rivendell knew it wouldn't be long before those same eyes saw through the act, which was exactly why the Emperor needed her for his own survival. Terry couldn't ignore the looming truth. Everyone connected to the Ferdiac experiment had been wiped out, no matter their rank, age, or innocence. If Rivendell's past ever came to light, it wouldn't just cost him the throne. It would tear the Empire apart. The peace that held the continent together would shatter. Enemies would rise from within, and chaos would spread like wildfire. Was it all enough to justify the Emperor casually stripping down every night? Well, technically, yes. But that wasn't the question she ended up asking. Curious, Terry eventually asked why he hadn't had gone to the High Priest for help if divine power could heal him. Wouldn't that be the logical solution? His answer was blunt. He didn't trust anyone else. Only Terry did. And that's because, like him, she had something to hide. When she pointed out that he barely knew her, and couldn't be sure she wouldn't betray him, the Emperor simply pantomimed a clean slice to the neck. Message received. Still skeptical, Terry asked how he'd even known she had divine power in the first place. Rivendell shrugged, saying it was a hunch. But from the way he looked at her, like he was certain, she wasn't buying it. Only she and her mother had ever known the truth, which left one chilling possibility. Had he known her mother? For a split second, a flicker of emotion passed across his face. Then Rivendell shook his head. No, he'd never had the pleasure. His belief came purely from instinct. But that flicker of disappointment in his eyes? It didn't vanish. Changing the subject, Rivendell steered the conversation back to business. He reminded the princess of their deal. He'd keep her secret if she helped him conceal his past involvement in the experiment. That's when it hit her. If she accepted, she wouldn't just be helping. She'd be his accomplice. If the truth came out, she'd be executed right alongside him. So she hesitated. Seeing her silent panic, Rivendell guessed what she was thinking. He reminded her that if the world found out who she really was, her life would be over anyway. If you could even call it living after that. Still, Terry didn't accept, so he switched tactics. He reminded her that once she became empress of the most powerful empire on the continent, she could order her awful relatives to kneel before her, or even make them dance like fools just for fun. That sealed the deal. Terry agreed. Revenge clearly hit a little too close to home. But in truth, it wasn't just about vengeance. She couldn't bring herself to abandon someone who might die without her help. Their secrets bound them now. They were in this together. Of course, doubts remained. She still had no idea how Rivendell had figured out her secret so precisely. But if he ever showed even a hint of betrayal, she already had a plan. She'd run to another kingdom and scream at the top of her lungs that the Emperor had a nightly shirt removal habit. Ahem. Also that he was part of the Ferdiac experiment. The terms were clear. 1 year, that's all he asked. 1 year by his side, and she'd be free. So for now, she'd enjoy the royal life, fancy robes, divine bedchambers and all, and quietly prepare for the day she'd see her twisted family fall to their knees like groveling worms. Back in Ruffion, while the Empire prepared for a royal wedding, the so-called king, or Teriella's father, was having a cozy dinner with his preferred children. The youngest asked an oddly innocent question. What if Terry really does become empress? What then? Before the king could answer, the prince and eldest daughter scoffed and jumped in. In their minds, there was no way a loud-mouthed misfit like Terry would ever wear the crown. No, they predicted she'd return in a coffin. The youngest stayed quiet, because even she had to admit Terry's beauty was undeniable. But still, they all agreed. She might be beautiful on the outside, but once she started talking, the fire in her words made her unbearable. Classic case of jealousy. She had both looks and brains, and they couldn't stand it. Eventually, the king did speak. And when he did, it wasn't to correct them. It was to insult both Terry and the Emperor, He claimed the two were a perfect pair, two miserable outcasts meant for each other. According to him, the rest of the noble world should thank Ruffian for sacrificing its defective bloodline. In his delusional logic, since the emperor was rumored to be cold and unforgiving, Terry was likely already dead. But just in case she survived and returned, he assured his children that he had already lined up a new marriage for her. A generous offer from King Charlemagne, who, unfortunately, happened to be a repulsive old tyrant in his 70s, infamous for having 30 queens, all mysteriously deceased. The man was rumored to murder his brides like it was part of a morning routine. So yes, Terry's instinct to never step foot back home, spot on. Good thing she had zero intention of returning to that nest of vipers. And fortunately, this is a romance manhwa, not a survival horror. When the prince nervously brought up what the crown prince might do once he found out what happened to Terry, the temperature dropped. Because everyone knew, when it came to raw magical power, Karajan wasn't just the strongest in Ruffian. He was one of the most powerful elementalists on the continent, and Terry was his beloved half-sister. If he ever discovered that she'd been sold off like livestock, the outcome wouldn't be pretty. As they scrambled to come up excuses to tell Karajan, the king remained disturbingly calm. He was confident. After all, Karajan had been sent far away to deal with the plague. He wouldn't return for a while. By the time he heard the truth, Terry would, according to the king's hopeful imagination, already be dead. And in the king's mind, that would be the end of it. Let's all look forward to that glorious moment when these royal clowns realize just how spectacularly they've played themselves. Because naturally, Empress Terry will be the one laughing last and loudest. Anyway, back in the Empire, Terry had just wrapped up another round of her nightly ritual with Rivenfell. Surrounded by divine wealth, ancient power, and a ridiculously good-looking emperor who kept flashing his abs like clockwork, it was starting to feel like a very confusing dream. As her gaze lingered a little too long, Rivenfell noticed and teased her, wondering what kind of thoughts she was having. Terry, ever defensive, playfully deflected, pretending he must be mistaking her for another princess. Her blushing face, however, betrayed her completely. Trying to save face, she made a bold counterattack, claiming anyone would turn red if they were touching someone's bare chest, even Zelem's. That earned a very visible twitch from the emperor, though he brushed it off with a warning smile that practically whispered, "Don't test me." But jokes aside, the undressing wasn't even his choice. They'd already tried every method, holding hands, blessings over clothing, you name it. None of them worked. Only direct contact seemed to trigger the divine energy. Hence the shirt removal, every night. Still, Rivenfell, being sassy, always found a way to enjoy it. He leaned in with that teasing smile, admitting he preferred undressing in front of her anyway. Terry panicked and quickly tried to reset the situation, backing away and stumbling over her words. She insisted it was time to return to her own chamber now that the ritual was complete. Oh, and just as a reminder, without her, he'd still be stuck faking drunkenness behind closed doors. The emperor smiled again, but this time, softer. He assured her he would never do anything she disliked. From now on, everything would be for her comfort. Caught off guard by his sudden sincerity, Terry fumbled to change the subject. She brought up their upcoming wedding, admitting she had never even attended one before, let alone starred in one. To her relief, Rivenfell felt the same. This would be his first time too, and he'd been worried he'd be the only one with cold feet. Sitting down in front of her, he gently brought up what he suspected was the real issue. Her family. He offered to skip inviting the royal house of Ruffian, if that would ease her burden. Terry was stunned. He had read her so easily even without her saying a word. Outwardly, she said the invitations must be sent, but not out of kindness. Oh no. In truth, she wanted them there. Every last jealous relative. She wanted them watching as she walked down the aisle, radiant and regal, while they squirmed in their seats. No riches in the world could buy the satisfaction she'd feel watching their stunned, bitter faces. Honestly, she was counting down the days just to see them choke on their envy, and she made it very clear. This was not a moment she was willing to miss. Rivenfell laughed, clearly amused by her boldness. He admired her strength and asked where it came from. Terry answered without hesitation. Her mother. Even when her entire family turned against her, her mother had loved her enough to teach her how to love herself. That love had carried her through every storm. Rivenfell agreed, Terry's mother must have been an incredible woman. But then, Terry shared a bittersweet memory. When she was born, her mother didn't even want to hold her. It wasn't until she turned 3 that her mother began to change. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe something else. But from that point on, her mother had given her all. Rivendell still stood by his belief. No matter what caused the shift, any mother who stood beside her child through everything was a good one. Terry was lucky to have had that. Terry, meanwhile, quietly noticed the way his tone changed. Softly. Almost as if he were remembering something painful. It struck her then. She knew so little about Rivendell's past. But before she could ask, the Emperor made his decision. He would honor her request. The entire royal family of Ruffion would be invited to their wedding. And soon, the fastest ship in the Empire set sail to fetch the guests she'd waited her whole life to confront. Time flew by like a storm wind. 1 week later, the fools of Ruffion had arrived. Unlike Terry, who was sent on a torturous 3-month journey in a creaky cart, her relatives arrived in style, sailing smoothly across the sea in a luxury vessel. No matter, for Terry this was a win, because she would finally serve the banquet she had long dreamed of. One seasoned with humiliation, garnished with envy, and served with a smile. King Ruffion and his loyal gaggle of offspring stepped foot into the Grand Empire, only to be greeted with a sight that would haunt their pride forever. The Emperor himself, waiting for them. And he didn't look pleased. Rivendell welcomed them with biting sarcasm. He remarked how bold it was of the king to make him wait, something no one had ever dared before. Teriella, standing off to the side, didn't bother hiding her satisfaction. Seeing her oh-so-important father bowing low with her arrogant siblings behind him, priceless. Then, like a normal mood-shifting tyrant, Rivendell let out a laugh. He claimed he was only jesting, and asked if he'd somehow offended them. The king gave a stiff laugh in return, pretending it was all a harmless joke. But the Emperor wasn't done. With a smile still on his lips and ice in his tone, he casually pointed out that while their journey took a week, Terry's trip had lasted 3 grueling months. He sarcastically praised Ruffion's engineers for designing a carriage so magnificently dreadful that it rotted to splinters by the time it arrived. The king scrambled to offer an explanation, but Rivendell continued. Surely, he mused, there must be some reason why Teriella was sent off in such a barely functioning ride. Unless, of course, that was Ruffion's grand idea of craftsmanship. Seeing the sweat break out on the king's brow, Rivendell chuckled again, masking another jab with the guise of humor. He said, of course he couldn't imagine that a great kingdom like Ruffion would show such carelessness toward its own princess. But everyone in that place knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't about jokes. It was a warning. A subtle, ruthless message. Harming the future Empress of Leonharda, even slightly, meant disrespecting the Empire itself. After his warm welcome, Rivendell turned to Teriella, took her hand, and announced he would now step aside to give her the long-awaited family reunion she had surely been dying to experience. Once the royal pests were ushered into a sitting room, the prince wasted no time making smug remarks. He scoffed at the idea that Terry would actually become Empress. Their father had specifically told them not to speak to her until he returned. Clearly, her brother wasn't great at following orders. Rather than entertaining the insult, Terry shifted the conversation to someone who actually mattered, Karajan. She asked where he was, because let's be honest, she missed him, not these clowns. Her older sister replied that the crown prince was still busy dealing with the plague investigation. That much made sense. If Karajan had found out what was happening, there was no way he wouldn't have stormed through Leonharda to crash this wedding. But her moment of thought was quickly shattered by her sister's voice, dripping with disdain. She called Terry a fool for believing she could ever be Empress. Terry didn't even blink. Instead, she threw the question back at them, wondering if they had expected to receive a funeral notice instead of a wedding invitation. The silence that followed was golden. Typical. They'd spent years tearing her down, then pretended none of it happened the moment it became inconvenient. A few months apart hadn't changed a lifetime of betrayal. Trying to backpedal, the siblings suddenly claimed it was all part of their grand plan. The older sister even had the nerve to say that Terry wouldn't be here if they hadn't pushed her to go, as if Terry owed them her entire future. She even tapped Terry's forehead like she was handing out wisdom, clearly convinced that she deserved gratitude. Meanwhile, the palace servant stood quietly in the background, watching it all. The Ruffion trio, of course, didn't seem to realize that every person in this palace was on Terry's side. Then again, they probably didn't care. They still saw her as the useless little obstacle they'd stepped over for years. But Terry wasn't going to just stand there and smile. With a cool tone and zero hesitation, she insulted them right back, mocking how their ambition far outweighed their actual intelligence. After all, they wanted power, but didn't even have the guts to fight for it properly. Life must be exhausting when you're all talk. The prince, offended, fired back. He smugly claimed that Terry wasn't married yet, and their father was currently speaking with the emperor to propose a better bride candidate. So that's where their confidence came from. They thought Rivendell could be persuaded to drop Terry in favor of someone more qualified. If only they knew. The emperor didn't want some polished princess from a diplomatic shortlist. He wanted Terry, title or no title. And their arrogance, it was hilarious. One little push and they were already spilling every desperate scheme they'd cooked up. Right on cue, Zellum arrived with a message from the emperor. Trying to stay in control, the prince snatched it and read it aloud, clearly convinced it was their moment of triumph. Except, the words didn't match their expectations. Terry was still officially named as the emperor's future empress. The room fell into stunned silence. All three siblings froze. Unbothered, Terry gracefully took her seat as a maid poured her tea. She casually announced that tomorrow, she planned to inform the emperor that her siblings had been conspiring against her. The siblings panicked, swearing it was all a misunderstanding. Terry tilted her head, calmly reminding them that they were surrounded by witnesses. Palace staff had seen and heard everything. So if they valued their lives, it was time they learned a bit of restraint. She smiled sweetly and delivered the final blow. They were no longer in Ruffion. This was her palace. And everyone here, they weren't servants of their father. And they were all loyal to her. The next morning, Terry sat calmly sipping tea beside the emperor, her expression oddly peaceful. Rivendell casually remarked that she must have had a lovely time with her family. Terry replied with a gentle smile, saying it was certainly eventful. Back at reception room, when she casually asked what they thought the emperor would do after learning about their little treachery, especially considering his reputation for swift retribution, panic set in. Still, Terry gave them a chance. She announced that anyone willing to sincerely apologize, by kneeling before her, would be forgiven. Pride, she warned, might cost them their lives. And wouldn't you know it? All three of them hit the floor faster than coins in a fountain. No excuses, but just a quick race to see who could grovel first. Back in the present, Rivendell gave her a sidelong glance. He suspected her family was plotting something again. They'd been too quiet since that day. But he reassured her not to worry. If necessary, he'd take care of it. Terry, still amused from yesterday's memory, told him not to waste his energy on petty matters. She argued that family issues should stay within the family. The last thing they needed was to escalate things into a political dispute between a kingdom and an empire. She would handle it her way. Rivendell looked at her, impressed. She seemed almost happy dealing with this mess. And honestly, she was. Terry was so thrilled by yesterday's events, she had forgotten not to smile. That's how satisfying it had been. Watching her confidence, Rivendell respected her decision. And Terry, in turn, couldn't help but reflect on how strange this all felt. The man once feared as a ruthless tyrant is now listening to her and following her lead. He's a certified gentleman in reality. Curious, she asked if anyone else knew about his nightly transformation. To her surprise, Rivendell admitted no. No one, not even Zellum. Despite his closeness, Zellum was deliberately kept in the dark. And yes, that made her the only one who knew. And honestly, if the transformation had been more visible, it would have been much harder to keep it hidden. Good thing the symptoms faded by morning. Still, the weight of being the only one to know hit her hard. Just then, Zellum walked into the room. Perfect timing, as usual, and unintentionally ended the serious conversation. Rivendell, still in teasing mode, commented that Zellum had no idea about his secret, because, thankfully, he didn't sleep in the Emperor's bedchamber. That comment clearly landed, awkwardly. A flustered Zellum immediately started shouting, waving his arms in defense. He had not been eavesdropping. He was just walking by. Rivendell chuckled and warned him that eavesdropping was a bad habit. Zellum, still red in the face, insisted he was simply delivering reports, and asked Terry not to mind the commotion. Terry, naturally, found the entire scene hilarious. She began teasing Zellum, enjoying his growing embarrassment. He tried to keep things professional, handing over the list of nobles who had requested to meet Terry before the wedding. They were the ones who had sent her letters weeks in advance. But Rivenfell waved it off. He told Zelim that Terry didn't enjoy such visits, and to reject them all on her behalf. Zelim grimaced. Of course, he'd follow orders. But he made it clear that this was just advice. He wasn't trying to control anything. He simply thought it might be risky for Terry to isolate herself from high society. Especially now. It was better to make a few allies before stepping into the lion's den. To help, he had even compiled a detailed list of the most influential nobles, the ones worth knowing. Terry was about to say she'd consider meeting them, but Zelim warned her that not everyone on that list was clean. Some were involved in shady dealings, like illegal alchemy or dangerous substances. So naturally, Rivenfell told Zelim to explain everything to Terry. After all, she was about to become the Empress. Zelim deferred, saying it was Terry's choice. But in that moment, Terry made her decision. She would learn it all. After everything that had happened, she knew this wasn't just a royal title anymore. She had power. Real power. And with that came responsibility. Zelim glanced at her, quietly impressed. She wasn't just a pretty face or a political pawn. She was stepping into her role with both eyes open. Rivenfell agreed. He noted how rare it was for someone to walk willingly down a difficult path. But Terry did it without hesitation. As Zelim and Rivenfell continued to trade playful jabs, Terry quietly observed them. Zelim might not be on her side, but he was definitely on his. And if Rivenfell had a loyal companion, it was this flustered, sharp-tongued aide. Then Rivenfell shifted the conversation again. He asked about the wedding preparations. Zelim reported that the hall was nearly ready, and when they stepped inside to see it, it was breathtaking. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air, and sunlight danced across polished marble floors. The entire space radiated warmth and celebration. Then came him, a man named Elihu. He entered the room, cheerfully announcing that he would purify the space with holy water. Terry's heart dropped. She knew that name. He was no ordinary priest. He was the youngest person in history to be blessed by the god, Semiula, and appointed as a high priest, revered, respected, and terrifyingly powerful, especially for someone with secrets to hide. Terry instinctively shrank behind Rivenfell. Elihu approached with calm demeanor and introduced himself. Terry returned the greeting with a shaky voice. Even as he stood still, divine energy radiated from him like a beacon. If he touched her, her secret might be exposed on the spot. Sensing her fear, Rivenfell immediately jumped in. He told Elihu that Terry was simply nervous in a new environment and asked for his understanding. The man nodded and promised not to disturb her further. Then Rivenfell asked how long the high priest planned to stay. Bad news. Elihu said he had no immediate travel plans. He'd be remaining in the Empire for a while. Something about the temple needing his presence again. He would even be attending the wedding himself. Terry internally panicked. That was the last thing she needed. Desperate for distance, she quickly claimed she was tired and needed rest. Rivenfell supported the decision without hesitation and began leading her away. But before they could escape, the man called out behind them. He offered Terry a blessing of purification, with a radiant smile. Rivenfell's expression didn't change, but his thoughts sharpened. There was a chance that Elihu had sensed something. He couldn't be sure, but he made a silent vow then and there. He would protect Terry's secret no matter what. So he turned back to the high priest, and smoothly stated that he must be the one in need of purification that day. After all, Terry was exhausted, and rest would do her more good than any blessing. As Terry disappeared into the hallway with her maid, Rivenfell reassured Elihu that he called on him soon. Late at night, Rivenfell paid another visit to Terry. Time for their usual healing session. But the moment he stepped into her room, she went straight into panic mode. Her mind was still spinning from earlier, convinced that Elihu might had picked up something odd about her. Luckily, Rivenfell reassured her that the man didn't seem to suspect a thing. Terry let out a small sigh of relief, but quickly reminded him. If her secret ever got exposed, their entire arrangement would go up in smoke. Trying to keep things light, Rivenfell asked why he should be punished for something he never even intended. But Terry shot back a blunt truth. Once her identity was no longer a secret, she'd have no reason to keep up the act. No reason to keep him around either. Still, Rivenfell stayed composed. He admitted that Elihu might had sensed something, but it was just a hunch, nothing concrete. Definitely nothing worth panicking over. But Terry didn't seem fully convinced, so He leaned in close, gaze locked onto hers. If she could trust anyone in this enormous palace, shouldn't it be the man who shared his deepest, most dangerous secret with her? Hadn't he already proven himself? Terry, now blushing from both his words and his proximity, chose to pivot the conversation entirely. She told him to hurry up and take off his shirt so they could get the healing session over with and send him back to his quarters. But Rivenfell didn't miss the dismissive tone. He sulked a little. Was she really so used to seeing him shirtless that it didn't faze her anymore? His once dazzling allure now downgraded to a wallpaper? Naturally, there was only one way to test that theory. With zero hesitation, and a smirk that spelled trouble, Rivenfell began to undress, even more. Not just the shirt this time. Layer by layer, as if he were preparing for a private performance. After all, they were alone. Terry's cheeks turned tomato red as she smacked his chest with a flustered yelp, warning him that this wasn't that kind of session. She was here to heal, not be front row for a striptease. Still embarrassed, she finally ordered him to just sit beside her and behave. Thankfully, he obeyed, possibly out of fear that her next slap might leave more visible mark on his bare chest. With that, their nightly ritual wrapped up smoothly. But then, Rivenfell's attention shifted to a curious little creature in the corner of the room. Terry introduced her newest companion, a plump little hamster named Mew. She'd picked him up earlier that day. Apparently, the tiny fluff ball reminded her of a pet she once raised with her mother back in her old kingdom. Rivenfell stared at the hamster like it had just spoken. Of course she brought home a random rodent. This was Terry, after all. Still, he just nodded and said that as long as it made her happy, he had no objections. In fact, the more distracted she was by things like this, the easier it was for him to sneak by when he was up to no good. Win-win. While Terry happily watched Moo shuffle around his cage, Rivenfell's eyes drifted toward the letter she'd left on the table. It had been passed on by Zelim, and the second he saw the sender's name, his mood changed instantly. Without saying another word, Rivenfell grabbed the letter and tore it clean in half. His voice was sharp now, far colder than usual. He reminded her that while he had agreed to respect her decisions, this was one matter he wouldn't budge on. When he first claimed the throne, he'd rooted out most of the corrupt nobles, but 2 remained. And Rillianif was one of them. Removing him had always been the goal, but doing so would have risked throwing the entire empire into chaos. Still, Rivenfell despised the man with every fiber of his being. This was the first time Terry had seen him that furious, and it wasn't just palace politics. This was personal. But next morning, Terry found herself having tea with one particular man. It was none other than the Marquise Rillanouef, who seemed eager to make an impression. He'd brought his own fancy tea set, clearly expecting this meeting to matter. Then, as her maid approached to offer her usual tea, the man cut in with a disapproving look. He politely yet condescendingly told her that servants should never interrupt when not called. It was improper for someone soon to be empress to allow such behavior. Terry apologized, saying her maid had only acted out of concern and that she'd speak with her later. But the nobleman wasn't finished. He reminded her that once she was empress, every little mistake would be magnified, and gossip would follow. Terry stared at him, holding back a sigh. She knew men like this well, those who used their power and polished manners to walk over everyone beneath them. Suddenly, the man offered a new escort and maid for her. Clearly, he thought she couldn't manage her own staff. Terry politely called her maid and asked for her usual tea. She explained to the noble that she wasn't fond of the one he'd brought. It simply didn't suit her taste. The nobleman smiled, pretending not to be offended. He suggested that her distaste was just due to unfamiliarity. In time, he said, she'd acquire a taste for it. Terry, clearly unimpressed, asked why she should force herself to enjoy something she disliked. Wouldn't that just make her sick eventually? But the man pressed again. With enough patience, he argued, even bitter things become enjoyable. Terry shrugged. She wasn't someone with endless patience for things she didn't enjoy. And frankly, that was okay with her. He seemed mildly offended by her honesty. He muttered something about Rivenfell also not appreciating fine tea, as if it were a tragedy. Just then, the high priest himself had arrived mid-tea. He smiled warmly, claiming he was just stopping by to greet them both. Terry's heart skipped. She hadn't expected him here, and her panic resurfaced instantly. Elihu politely asked if he could join them, but before anyone could respond, the nobleman excused himself with a bow, saying he had another appointment. As he left, he told the high priest, rather smugly, that Terry might benefit from his guidance when it came to tea. The priest watched the nobleman leave and then leaned closer to Terry, whispering that the man smelled like evil. Finally, someone said it out loud. Elihu warned her not to get too close to that man, no matter how kind the man appeared. It was Terry's choice, of course, but it wouldn't be wise. Terry tried to change the subject. But the high priest suddenly remarked that she smells like flowers. He was now dangerously close. If he touched her even for a second, her secret might be exposed. Just as his hand began to move, Rivenfell stepped between them like a shadow. He grabbed Elihu's arm mid-motion and asked what he was doing. Startled, the high priest bowed and explained that he was just offering a greeting. Rivenfell didn't budge and pointed out that the man looked like he was doing more than just saying hello. Elihu raised his hands in surrender, swearing he had no ill intentions. He apologized to Terry for startling her and added that if she ever needed him, he'd be happy to offer the blessing of purification later. With that, he excused himself and left. Rivenfell's gaze lingered on the retreating priest. One thing was now certain. The man suspected something. But Rivenfell had made a silent promise. As long as he breathed, no one would lay a hand on Terry, not even a god. Rivenfell gently asked Terry if she was okay. She replied that she was, at least on the surface. Curious, he asked how her tea time with the high priest went. That man? Terry firmly said that he was the last person she'd ever enjoy having tea with. Then, trying to redirect the conversation, she mentioned that she also run into the Marquis in the garden. He'd insisted on showing her his special tea collection, and unfortunately, with so many eyes on her, she hadn't been able to decline. The second she mentioned the Marquis' name, Rivenfell's expression changed, and Terry noticed it immediately. Trying to soften the moment, she added that she didn't think the nobleman would ever want to see her again anyway, claiming he had no use for her. Rivenfell looked guilty. He seemed to believe this was his fault. But Terry firmly disagreed. She knew how to tell the difference between the guilty and the innocent. The one who disrespected her was the Marquis, not Rivenfell, and she made it clear. She wasn't here to be some delicate greenhouse flower he had to protect all the time. Still, she assured him not to worry. Whatever needed to be dealt with, she'd handle it tomorrow. Rivenfell teased that she must really hate taking the easy route. Terry smirked. It's not that she had to do everything herself. But if something ever felt too risky or out of hand, she'd simply shove the problem his way and run. He chuckled, genuinely amused. You've got a lot to learn. She grinned back, and you've got a lot to offer. One night, Rivenfell visited a prison cell deep inside the palace. His mother was there, alive, well, and looking anything but remorseful. She blinked in surprise. His hair hadn't changed into silver. But Rivenfell looked her dead in the eye and said it was because he found someone who helped him remember who he used to be, before she twisted him into something monstrous. So, of course, he wasn't planning to let Terry go. Meanwhile, Zelim was helping Terry plan out the wedding preparations, and surprisingly, it all felt much easier than Terry had expected. But that wasn't what was on her mind. She stared at Zelim and said she wanted to talk about something else. Without holding back, she asked about the letter from Marquis. Why had Zelim, of all people, suggested someone like that? Zelim calmly replied that he had no particular reason, other than recommending the most influential people in the Empire. That explanation didn't sit well with Terry. Was he really willing to risk causing a rift between himself and the Emperor? To him, it wasn't personal. Politics never was. Sometimes even bad power could be used for good, so long as it got results. Terry disagreed. From her view, no matter how noble the intent, power like that always left destruction in its wake. But Zelim pushed back. Then, as if giving a good example, Zelim admitted that he knew about Ferdiac experiment. Zelim made it clear. He didn't support human experimentation. It was a crime. But he also believed the world was dying, and desperate times demanded desperate methods. What if the alchemist's experiment had succeeded? What if it had saved the world? Terry's voice was sharp. It hadn't. She knew it firsthand. The people involved didn't survive. Not really. Rivenfell was one of the few who did, and even he bore the scars. Returning to the topic of the Marquis, he admitted she wasn't wrong. That man was a walking red flag, ambitious, ruthless, and driven to rule the South. But if the Empire ever went to war, someone like him could be a powerful asset. Terry reluctantly agreed. The thought of trusting someone like that made her sick. But if he ever betrayed them, the entire empire could crumble. As she continued rambling about political theories and strategy, Zelim asked if she wants to be trained as his assistant instead of the Empress. After all, he was practically dying from the workload alone. Of course, Terry declined. Before leaving, he apologized for dumping so many responsibilities on her, but Terry just smiled. He didn't need to say sorry. She was using the Emperor for her own goals, after all. Then came the day of the wedding. That morning, Terry was told her entire family had slipped out of the Empire in secret the night before. It didn't surprise her, only annoyed her slightly. Still, she held her head high and prepared for the ceremony. When the announcement echoed through the halls, "The bride is entering," the whole empire held its breath. As their wedding ceremony neared its end, the high priest declared that the couple would now seal their eternal bond with a kiss. Terry and Rivenfell momentarily pause. Sure, they were technically married now, but it was a one-year arrangement. Were they really going to kiss in front of this many people? Of course, so Rivenfell leaned closer and told her to close her eyes, as he sweetly calls her Terry, for the first time. And just like that, Terry and the Emperor of Leonharda sealed their deal with a kiss. That same night, Terry found herself realizing something awkward. Every night before, they'd simply returned to their own rooms after her treatment sessions with the Emperor. They'd never once shared a bed. But tonight was different. This was their first night after the wedding, which meant they'd now be sleeping in the same room, possibly the same bed. And to make it worse, she'd have to sit across from him at breakfast, pretending none of it was weird. While she was lost in her mental spiral, Rivenfell leans in, casually pinching her cheeks with a grin. Apparently, she had worked hard today, so now it was his turn to offer a massage treatment. Not that she asked for it, but he just couldn't keep his hands off her. What followed was basically a poke fest on the bed. Before she knew it, she had flopped back onto the mattress, and Rivenfell hovered above her with a gleam in his eye. He teasingly asked if she wasn't going to ask him to remove his shirt this time. She told him there was no need since his hair was still black. And right on cue, the clock chimed. In an instant, his hair turned to silver. He smirked, asking if she was going to give the usual order now, or maybe try a new kind of treatment instead. He guided her hand to his abs, casually suggesting she try touching a place she'd never touched before. Terry just blinked at him, completely flustered. This man is too much for her own heart. The next morning, she woke up to find Rivenfell sleeping peacefully beside her. Her heart immediately panicked. Why was he beside her? What happened last night? Bits and pieces returned to her memory, but something still didn't feel right. Especially the odd sensation poking at her chest. It wasn't Rivenfell. It was Mew. Her adorable pet hamster was squishing himself against her chest with all the energy of a rebellious pillow. Wasn't he supposed to be in her room? Terry started mumbling about how extraordinary he was for breaking into the bridal suite, but when she jokingly asked if he was even really a hamster, he spoke, talked with full sentences. Terry froze, staring at him like she'd just woken up in the wrong Manhwa. In a panic, she grabbed her cheek and gave it a hard pinch. Nope, not dreaming. Apparently, he had knocked her out last night on purpose, because, in his words, things were moving too fast. And since he'd already broken the rule of not interfering, he figured he might as well save her from a situation that was quickly escalating. Naturally, Terry bombarded him with questions. What promise? How can a hamster talk? What even are you? Mew, or rather, the fluffy creature now claiming to be Semiula, casually explained that she must have felt something, because they shared the same energy. Semiula explained that the source of her power was the very force that gave life to the world. He wasn't just any old spirit. He was Semiula, the god who loved humans so much that he planted the world tree himself. Though not the original creator of humanity, he treated them like his own children. That's why the continent bloomed with life, because of him. Still, Terry had one burning question. Why a hamster? The god shrugged, as much as a tiny creature could. He liked the disguise. It kept him unnoticed. Had he revealed his true form, greedy humans would have fought to possess him. And if he'd chosen to appear in human form, someone strong enough to manage his power would have had to accompany him. Which, let's be honest, wasn't realistic. Terry glanced at her sleeping husband beside her, worried that he might hear them talking. But Semiula casually reassured her. He'd already put Rivenfell to sleep. Even with all this wild information, Terry couldn't just accept that he was Semula without proof. So the little ball of fluff rolled over and made the room explode with flowers. Petals bloomed everywhere in a gorgeous, overwhelming display. Okay, maybe he was legit. Once things calmed down, Terry asked how he even got into the room. He said he came to give his greetings before returning to the temple. Noticing her disappointment, the god gently nudged her, promising he would return, and that no matter what happened, he would never abandon her or the world. Just then someone approached. Semula quickly vanished while Terry called after him, desperate to ask more. But his voice echoed one last time, soft and comforting. I'll always be watching over you. A moment later, the maids entered. They took one look at the flower-filled room and gasped. To them, it definitely looked like something steamy had happened the night before. Later that morning, as Terry returned to her duties as Empress, Zelem couldn't stop grinning. Terry rolled her eyes and told him to laugh all he wanted, just like the maid earlier. She even tossed in a fake excuse about leaving the window open and the petals flying in by accident. Yeah, totally believable. Then, Terry reads something odd, so she eventually asks him if he knows someone named Ayana. Zelem confirmed that Ayana was his sister, and had apparently applied to be her exclusive maid, though he quickly added she looked nothing like him, as if that clarified anything. Terry asked if he wanted her to be chosen, but Zelem immediately said no. Being the Empress's personal maid was a prestigious position, too risky for someone like his sister. It might even put her in danger, and if she got too close, it would make it harder for Zelem to use Terry for political advantage. He didn't even deny it. Terry, amused and slightly impressed, respected his honesty. She agreed not to hire Ayana and left the task of choosing her exclusive maid entirely in Zelem's hands. He promised to select someone based not on power, but character. Someone kind and helpful for palace life. That surprised her, and honestly, it was kind of sweet. As Zelem walked away, Ayana immediately approached him, asking if he'd talked to the Empress yet. Clearly, she'd been rehearsing her congratulations speech for the wedding. Then she added, completely unbothered, that people had already started gossiping about the petals on Terry's bed. And just like that, Terry's cheeks were on fire again. Back at her old home, Terry's father was seething. He still couldn't stomach the fact that the Emperor had dared call him arrogant, and worse, forbid Terry from ever seeing him again. The memory of him being forced to kneel in public, only to be kicked out like a disgrace, made his blood boil. One of his sons, clearly overconfident, tried to lighten the mood. He boldly declared he'd rather live outside of Empire anyway. Without the World Tree, the Empire wasn't as intimidating as people thought. That's when her father snapped. He asked if the fool actually wanted to shatter the peace agreement and drag the continent into war. But the son just smirked, hinting that some kingdoms had already begun making moves behind the scenes. In his twisted logic, they could crush the Empire, and even behead Terry while they were at it. Charming family reunion. But then, bam, a shadow loomed behind them. Karajan had arrived. He stepped in like a walking storm, voice icy as he asked whose neck they were talking about. With a deadly calm, he reminded them of his previous warning. No matter how many children their king had, Terry was the only one he considered family. If anyone dared to harm her, they'd answer to him. Then, shifting focus, Karajan demanded to know where Terry was now. Meanwhile, Rivenfell was not in the best mode either. Zelem noticed how anxious his boss looked and asked what was wrong. Rivenfell then admitted something was off. Apparently, he'd forgotten what happened the night before. Completely blank. Which was bizarre, considering how routine their evenings had become. Zelem, sensing where this was going, wisely chose to remove himself from the drama. Good luck, he practically said with his eyes, backing away from the emotional landmine. Rivenfell then remembered something odd. Terry's behavior that morning had been unusually awkward. Not the fun kind. It made him wonder, had he done something wrong last night? Elsewhere, Terry was in full distraction mode, decorating Moo's cage like a woman trying to bribe her way into divine favor. She kept wondering what more she could do to stop him from disappearing again. Flowers? Velvet? A tiny throne? Her thoughts were interrupted by Rivenfell arriving and softly calling her name. She pointed out that it wasn't midnight yet, which led to an awkward exchange about how they were married now, meaning they could talk whenever they wanted. Rivenfell gently nudged her to start calling him by name, since she already followed him as her emperor. But Terry wasn't having it. No empress in history had ever casually addressed her emperor by name. Still, Rievenfell brushed that aside. What really mattered, he said, was that she didn't toss him away. That one caught her off guard. Suddenly, he looked almost nervous. He hesitantly asked if he'd done something wrong the night before. Terry, startled, said no, but in her head she was spiraling. Why was he bringing it up? Had he sensed something? Trying to deflect, she awkwardly admitted that she didn't enjoy one specific part, the wedding kiss. The emotional facepalm hits hard. Rievenfell looked like his world had just ended. Regret crept into her chest. Maybe she should have told him ahead of time, or handled the moment better. But then, with a sulking yet determined face, he declared that they should try again. A do-over kiss. Before she could object, he gently pulled her closer. Now Terry was the one spiraling. Was this man incapable of making mistakes? Everything about him, from the way he looked at her to the way he held her, made her feel unsteady. Still, he offered her an out. If she didn't like it this time, she could push him away. Terry stared at him, knowing full well this was emotional blackmail with hidden strong abs. And yet, she leaned in. This time the kiss was warm, sweet. It made both of them forget the awkwardness from before. But just as things grew deeper, something strange happened. Terry suddenly wobbles. Rievenfell rushed to catch her, eyes filled with concern. It wasn't just clumsiness. Her energy had destabilized. It was as if something had transferred between them during the kiss. Even more bizarre, his hair had turned back to its original color. He carried her to bed, worried sick and ready to call a doctor. But Terry muttered that she was fine. It was just a kiss. And then everything went strange. Rievenfell stared at her, stunned. Wait, was it because you were tempted by me? Embarrassed, Terry tried to brush it off, but Rievenfell just smirked and warned her. Next time, she might not notice when he decides to seduce her again. And with that smug remark, he lingered by her bedside a moment longer, asking one final question. Why had she kissed him back? Terry hesitated. He softened, saying she didn't need to answer now, just whenever she was ready. Then, like a gentleman, he wished her good rest and closed the door behind him. Outside, he collapsed dramatically against the wall. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had actually kissed her, held her, felt her warmth. And for once, he wished time could just freeze, so he could live in that one perfect moment forever. Surely, the Emperor was a full-blown closet simp for his wife now, no doubt about it. But the real question is, how on earth did it all start like this in the first place? Rievenfell is still sitting there with his heart beating fast, fully lost in his own thoughts, when reality rudely taps him. His advisor, Zelim, suddenly walks up. One look at the Emperor's face, and Zelim immediately knows he has interrupted something intense. Rievenfell quickly denies that he was plotting vengeance or anything dramatic like that, but he does say that while Zelim is extremely talented, he is also painfully tactless. Zelim, not missing a beat, accepts the praise with pride, and casually adds that he is not only competent, but also very sensible. However, he points out that if the Emperor keeps him working overtime on the same salary, that sensibility might disappear. He explains that there is an emergency that needs Rievenfell's attention, so he can finally clock out and leave. Unfortunately for Zelim, the Emperor is barely listening. Zelim can't help calling him out. Just earlier, Rievenfell was stressing over their first night, convinced the Empress didn't like it, and now he's grinning like a fool. Rievenfell snaps back, asking Zelim what exactly he thinks he is. Zelim answers instantly, saying he's an emperor with zero patience. Rievenfell doesn't even argue. He lets out an awkward laugh because, well, that part is true. As they walk together, he reminds the Emperor that the Empress isn't going anywhere. There's no need to rush. That advice only makes things worse because Rievenfell immediately starts imagining Teriella again. He admits that if she looks at him with that soft, rabbit-like expression, all logic completely leaves his body. Her green eyes shine in a way that ruins his focus, and when the wind lifts her pink hair, it looks like petals floating through the air. He's so deep in simping husband mode that Zelim honestly believes Rievenfell might someday throw a celebration just to honor the fact that Terry is breathing. With a tired sigh, he decides to give actual advice. If Rievenfell sees Terry as a little rabbit, then he needs to act like a careful hunter. Move slowly. Set the mood. Make her feel safe. If he rushes, she'll panic and run. But once she lowers her guard, well, Things will naturally go his way. With that slightly questionable guidance delivered, the two finally stop talking about romance and return to their actual palace work for the day. The next morning, Phoebe, the Viscount's daughter personally chosen by Zelem to serve as Teriella's maid, cheerfully informs the Empress that it's time to leave. Before stepping out, Teriella pauses and looks back. She remembers how Semiula promised he would return soon. Apparently, even a god can lie. While waiting for Miyu's return, Teriella had tried to learn what Semiula liked by reading a book she asked Phoebe to bring. She figured that if she decorated his little cage, his hamster throne, he might come back faster. Maybe it would even motivate the hamster god to create a new world tree and save their world from ending. That said, even Terry isn't entirely certain that the world tree appears only at Semiola's whim. Rievenfell notices her expression and asks if she's nervous. Teriella admits that she is. This is her first official appearance as Empress, and she never imagined it would take place in the temple of all places. Rievenfell calmly reassures her. Since it's a ceremony day, the high priest will be busy and won't have time to focus on her. They can just sit quietly, and everything will be fine. He adds that most of the senior priests left a few days ago for volunteer work, so only a handful remain. Even Elihu will be too occupied to bother them. And most importantly, he promises that he will stay by her side the entire time. Unfortunately, plans do not survive reality. The moment the Emperor and Empress arrive at the temple, the high priest greets them warmly, with several priests lined up behind him. Teriella's mind immediately starts drafting an emergency escape plan. That's when she notices something strange wiggling on top of the high priest's head. Looking closer, she realizes it's Semiula. The hamster god is sitting there happily, waving his tiny hand at her like nothing is wrong at all. Inside the temple, the high priest warmly welcomes them and explains that a separate room has been prepared, so the Emperor and Empress can rest before the ceremony begins. He even reassures them that they are free to speak comfortably, since he is a trusted subordinate. Teriella thanks him politely, but her mind is busy replaying one very important question. When did Miyu disappear again? Elihu then apologizes for their last meeting, admitting that he never meant to surprise her that day. He explains that the reason he approached her before was because he felt divine power coming from her. Even so, he admits it was immature of him to act that way, which is why he wanted to apologize properly this time. He also adds that lately, he has been sensing Semiula's divine presence in many places, so he assumed he must be really exhausted after a long journey. The man has no idea the hamster god was literally sitting on his head just moments ago. As Terry listens, she realizes she felt that divine energy too, the moment she entered the temple. And now that she thinks about it, no one has ever spoken badly about the high priest. He even helped her when she had trouble with the Marquise. The only reason she avoided him afterward was fear that her secret would be exposed. But watching him now, he really doesn't seem like a bad person. That thought pushes Terry to ask about the god he serves. After all, if anyone knows Semiula well, it should be the high priest. Rievenfell immediately tries to stop her, already knowing how this will end. Once the high priest gets started, there is no stopping him. He switches into full lecture mode like an overly excited history teacher. Sure enough, 2 hours later, he is still passionately talking about how Semiula healed the world in the past. But none of this helps Terry at all. She is not looking for a life story. She just wants to know if the god likes jewelry or desserts for future bargaining purposes. By this point, Rievenfell is half asleep beside her, which is exactly why he tried to stop her earlier. Eventually, the high priest admits that people no longer praise Semiula the way they once did. Some even curse the god, and priests were attacked with stones because people believe they worship the one responsible for their world's suffering. Rievenfell comments that when the world starts falling apart, people always need someone to blame. He then asks if the high priest himself ever blamed the god. Elihu simply smiles and explains that blaming the god would be like blaming his parents for decisions he made on his own. They raised him well, but that doesn't mean they are responsible for everything that happens afterward. That calm atmosphere breaks instantly when Zelem rushes in with another priest, bringing news of an emergency. Several high priests who recently went on an expedition have been brought back suffering from a dangerous illness. Worse, hundreds of people have already gathered inside the temple for the ceremony. That means everyone present could already be exposed. If nothing is done, the illness could spread across the empire. Zelim reports that the junior priests who remained behind cannot use divine healing. And even though Elihu has divine power, he can only treat a limited number of people at once. Simply put, there is no one capable of handling this many patients. Despite the tension, Rivenfell stays calm. He immediately orders the temple gates to be closed to contain the situation. His plan is to keep the illness from spreading beyond the temple while using the high priest's help inside. He instructs Zelim to send urgent requests to nearby temples for medical support and orders troops to maintain order, knowing people will panic once they realize what is happening. Without hesitation, the high priest declares that under his authority, the temple hall will be closed and treatment will begin immediately. His Majesty acknowledges how heavy this burden must feel. If this truly is an outbreak, it would be impossible to save everyone. The illness won't kill the high priest overnight, but delaying treatment would make the situation uncontrollable. Still smiling, the high priest says the god gave him strength to help people, and he will do everything he can for those who need him. Once the plan is set, Teriella hesitantly speaks up. She knows this is a serious emergency, but what she needs to ask is important too, so she hopes no one finds it strange. With a cautious tone, she asks whether the hamster that was sitting on the high priest's head earlier might know where it went. After a long pause, the high priest explains that the adorable little creature often hangs around him, and sometimes he even lets it ride along on his head. As for where it went, though, he honestly cannot say. Meanwhile, both the emperor and his advisor quickly assume that the strange hamster question is proof she is overwhelmed by the emergency. Before things get worse, they insist she be escorted to another room so she can rest. Terry admits to herself that she probably sounds unhinged right now, but that so-called adorable hamster is the key to solving everything happening in the temple. Unfortunately, she is the only one who knows that. Rivenfell reassures her, promising that she has nothing to fear and that he will return soon. He even pulls her into a hug like she might collapse the moment he leaves. Terry is not exactly a fragile flower, but she does not reject the hug either. Blushing slightly, she tells him she is fine and that his attention is needed elsewhere. As the emperor and the high priest head out, Terry quickly calls Zelim over. She instructs him to investigate where the high priests were first exposed to the plague. High-ranking priests are usually sent to deal with outbreaks because of their strong divine power, so all of them falling ill at the same time makes no sense. She also points out that even junior priests know the symptoms well. Anyone showing signs should have been isolated immediately, yet somehow many were infected anyway. And on top of all that, a massive crowd has gathered at the Great Temple for the sacred ritual that day. That alone makes it even more urgent to trace the origin of the illness. Understanding the weight of her words, Zelim rushes off to carry out her orders. Once she is finally alone, Terry discovers exactly where Semiula has been hiding. The hamster god is standing at the table, happily munching on dessert. When she asks where he has been, he casually replies that he was here and there. Apparently, he stopped by to see her earlier, met the new maid Phoebe, and even helped himself to a few gemstones from the cage Terry calls his home. He then rambles on about how well she chose Phoebe. According to him, Phoebe was originally meant to possess divine power. Even though her life took a different path, he believes she is better off staying by the Empress's side. Terry cuts him off before he can keep drifting. She asks if he is even aware that the temple is dealing with a plague. Instead of answering, Semiula throws a sunflower seed away in disgust and complains about how offensive it is to his divine taste. Divine wrath, apparently, now comes in the form of food reviews. Terry reminds him that this is not the time to be offended by snacks. The entire temple is at risk as they speak. Switching to a different treat, Semiula finally responds. He says she does not need to explain it twice because he already knows. He then admits that interfering directly does not fall under divine rules. Saving people here would be unfair to those who suffered and died elsewhere from the same illness. With his hands tied, he claims he cannot step in, adding that if he truly had free reign, he would never have allowed the endless conflict humans create among themselves. While the hamster god seems perfectly content eating in peace, Terry reminds him that they are currently inside the great temple dedicated to him, the god Semiula. In short, a deadly plague is knocking at the doors of his most sacred place of worship. She asks if that really does not bother him at all. She can already picture what happens next. Angry and desperate believers losing faith, tearing the temple apart in their rage. There are not many temples left that still worship Semiula, and if the great temple were to fall, there might not be anything left at all. The hamster suddenly starts trembling and shouts that he remembers the very day the Great Temple was built. He even personally gave the oracle a constellation of gemstones to decorate it. There is no way he will allow it to be destroyed. Now that the switch flips, and the tiny god becomes deeply concerned about the terrible evil threatening his precious temple. Though, to be fair, it is hard to tell whether he is more attached to the temple itself or the shiny jewels inside it. Sadly, the problem remains. He is powerless to act directly. In his current incomplete form, the full extent of his power is sealed. If he forces himself beyond his limits, he will lose the ability to descend into the world for years. That is why there is only one solution left. His vessel must act, and that vessel is Terry, the secret holy maiden. Hopping onto her head, Semiola announces with excitement that the temple awaits its savior. Terry immediately shuts that down. She reminds him that she never agreed to help. In truth, she doubts she can do anything meaningful at all. She has never been able to use divine power on command. On top of that, acting recklessly could get her infected, and if the Empress collapses, the chaos would be far worse than the plague itself. The god calls that nonsense. A simple blessing from him would be more than enough to protect her from something like this. He even questions whether she understands her own divine power at all. It is not every day that a literal god gives a lesson on divine abilities, but given the situation, he does exactly that. He also reminds her not to fool herself into thinking the high priest can handle this alone. If Terry refuses, countless people will die, and eventually, even the high priest will fall. When Terry asks if her stepping in will truly change anything, the god says it might. Every choice twists the future in new directions, and not even he can see all the outcomes. If saving people were the only issue, Terry would step forward without hesitation. But the moment she does, she will expose herself as the long-awaited Divine Maiden. That revelation would throw the entire continent into chaos. Some would try to use her power. Others would try to kill her for it. One wrong step could lead straight to her death, with no one stepping forward to protect her. And yet, if she turns away now, she would be accepting the deaths of others. Not only the high priest, but also Zelim and even Rievenfell would be doomed. Her hesitation sends the god into a panic. Sitting in her hands, he blurts out that if that is what worries her, he can even lend her his hidden sacred relic. He dramatically lists everything he has already given her. Visions of the future, guidance on using her power, and now a sacred relic as well. Surely that is enough to make her act. But maybe because she somehow pushed a god this far, Terry finally makes her decision. She dashes forward, thinking that a sacred relic infused with divine power might at least slow the disaster. And if all else fails, she jokes to herself that it could probably be sold during hard times. That thought dies the moment she reaches the end of the hallway. What greets her is chaos. People are panicking, crying out for help, and collapsing in fear. Terry never imagined the plague would spread this fast or look this horrifying. Not much time has passed, yet the high priest already looks worn down. He has been using his divine power again and again, without rest. If goodness had a physical form, it would look exactly like him in this moment, continuing to heal people despite exhaustion and the shadow of death looming over him. That sight alone makes Terry's heart pound wildly. It feels like she is watching the world fall apart right in front of her. Semiola tells her that the heat building inside her is her divine power responding to the call of emotions she has buried and ignored for so long. Tapping her gently, he tells her not to hold back and to trust him. With his guidance, Terry finally releases her power. In an instant, golden light floods the entire area. Within seconds, everyone is healed. The plague vanishes as if it was never there, and the temple is saved. Terry stands there stunned, mumbling that this feels a bit excessive for what was supposed to be a simple healing spell. The god agrees, admitting that it turned out far more dramatic than even he expected. Of course, Terry bolts straight back to the waiting room, and now she sits down with her heart pounding like it's trying to escape her chest. At least the crowd believes the massive wave of divine power came from the high priest. Terry has absolutely no intention of correcting that misunderstanding. Moments later, a very stressed husband rushes in. Rievenfell immediately checks on her, asking if she is hurt, if she feels weak, or if she noticed anything strange happening to her body. He then goes straight for the real question and asks if what just happened was her doing. Terry avoids his eyes and pretends she has no idea what he is talking about. But Rivenfell is not convinced. He knows that kind of power is far beyond what the High Priest can manage. On top of that, he saw her sneak out of the waiting room earlier. Cornered, Terry finally admits it was her. Rivenfell's worry turns into frustration. He reminds her that he already told her to stay out of it because he was afraid she would put herself in danger. When Terry argues that far more lives would have been lost if she had done nothing, Rivenfell refuses to accept it. He insists it was not her decision to make, and that the High Priest had the situation under control. Contract or not, he would rather she never use her divine power in front of anyone except him. From the side, Teriella mutters that Rivenfell is protesting a bit too much, and secretly asks Terry if she wants him to put her husband to sleep again. Terry ignores that suggestion. She tells Rivenfell that her safety was never truly at risk, but countless others were. Rivenfell, however, makes his position painfully clear. He does not care about anyone else. To him, Terry's life is his one and only priority. Terry fires back without hesitation. She points out that the fall of his empire would be disastrous for her own power and influence. She also reminds him that she still has unfinished business with her family. Their little argument is cut short when the High Priest enters the waiting room. Rivenfell is just about to ask him to escort the Empress elsewhere, when Elihu interrupts first. Looking straight at Terry, he asks if it is possible that she was responsible for the divine display in the temple. Rivenfell immediately shuts that down, calling it an ill-timed joke, and suggesting the High Priest put that imagination to better use helping Zelim. The High Priest calmly admits that he suspected the Emperor already knew the truth, especially after seeing how quickly he rushed back to the waiting room. Still, Rivenfell continues to deny everything, positioning himself firmly in front of Terry like a human shield. Sensing their intentions, Elihu awkwardly acknowledges that they wish to keep the matter secret and allow the people to believe he was responsible for the miracle. Terry thanks him. Unfortunately, that gratitude only confirms his suspicion. The High Priest admits he was testing her. Thankfully, this also means she can mentally take back the thank you. Then he asks the real question. Why must she keep her identity hidden? If the Divine Maiden has truly returned to a world on the brink, should she not step forward to calm the disaster unfolding before them? This time, Rivenfell answers for her. He questions whether the High Priest truly knows the limits of the Divine Maiden's power, or if he is relying on faith alone. If the world does not change after her reveal, then the anger and disappointment of the people will demand a sacrifice. And it will not be the unseen God they blame, but the long-awaited Divine Maiden who failed to save them. Elihu quickly insists that he would never intend such harm. Rivenfell acknowledges that he knows this, adding that if the High Priest were truly capable of such cruelty, he would have already lost far more than his pride. Bowing deeply, the High Priest accepts it as fair punishment for speaking carelessly. He explains that his words came from relief at knowing the god's care for humanity still remains, and he assures the Empress that he means no offense. Meanwhile, Teriella continues chewing like none of this concerns him, and casually tells Terry that the High Priest is devoted enough to give his life for the Divine Maiden without hesitation. The High Priest then adds that the fate of the world is not something Terry must carry alone. Her path should be decided by her own will. This time, Terry smiles and genuinely thanks him. The three of them agree to keep her identity as the Divine Maiden's secret. Their so-called god, however, is stretched out on the table with a full stomach after stuffing himself with sweets. Still, the High Priest's cooperation will be vital. If Terry ever comes under suspicion again, any sudden surge of divine power can be conveniently explained away by him. With that settled, Terry turns her attention to the final issue of the day. She looks at the overfed hamster god and reminds him of their deal. With a terrifying voice, she demands that he hand over the sacred relic immediately. A few days later, rumors spread through the city like spilled ink. People whispered that the Empress had somehow ended up with Semioula's sacred relic. Life didn't just return. It showed off. The streets were alive again. Children ran around laughing, healthy and loud, as if the recent plague had never happened. On one of the roads leading out of the capital, a cart creaked forward. The bearded driver muttered that he had no idea what kind of urgent business his passenger was in such a rush for. He glances at the hooded young man and expresses his hope that the stranger won't leave the capital before the sacred ritual. The hooded man, however, had only one concern: getting to his destination fast. Then, He casually asked about the rumors spreading through the city. That was all the invitation the coachman needed. He launched right into it, proudly explaining how the high priest had healed everyone from the plague. One moment, people were convinced they were about to die. The hooded passenger scoffed, unimpressed. He said he didn't believe stories like that. But the coachman only laughs it off, insisting that the miracle merely proves the god is working through the high priest. Then his voice drops. There are whispers that a divine maiden from an ancient prophecy may be walking among them once more. He went on, saying that some people believed the power they saw that day was far greater than anything the high priest had ever shown before. That was why they thought the miracle might not have come from him alone. If such a divine maiden truly existed, the driver said, it would be nothing short of a miracle. Once again, he thanked the heavens that their God had not forsaken them. Not long after, the cart stopped. The hooded man stepped down and thanked the man for the ride. The passenger calmly said he would wait there for the next carriage. The driver laughed, thinking it was a joke. When the man insisted he was serious, he explained that he couldn't reveal his destination because of certain circumstances. That only made the driver more curious. If nothing else, he asked, could the stranger at least share a secret? After a pause, the hooded man finally said he was heading to the Etheria Empire. He couldn't stay in this land any longer. The driver remarked that it seemed surprisingly easy for the stranger to open up to him. Then his tone turned serious. The road to Etheria was dangerous. When it came time to pay, the driver waved it off. He said he'd earned enough for the day. On his way home, he planned to buy meat for his family and save some money to help those in need. That's when the passenger reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a flat flask, offering it as payment instead. The driver assumed it was alcohol and accepted without hesitation. He took a long, confident swig, drinking like a man enjoying a well-earned reward. The hooded man remarks how it made him happy to see people living with care and love for one another. Then the flask slipped from the driver's hand and hit the ground. The stranger's voice stayed calm as he said the world tree needed to be revived quickly if people wished to keep living days as joyful as this one. The driver suddenly collapsed, coughing violently, his body betraying him in seconds. The man standing over him added that if he were caught, the tree would never be restored. He suggested the driver think of his fate as a necessary sacrifice for the entire continent. He also promised that he would return the world to the way it once was. With that, the silver-haired man removed his hood, a faint smile on his face, and quietly murmured that he would be meeting the Divine Maiden very soon. Back at the palace, Zelim reported in, saying he had followed the Empress's orders exactly. After closely examining the priests from the main temple, the truth finally surfaced. The infected blood from the Ferdiac experiment victims had been mixed into the water supply used by the senior priests. And once that blood was consumed, the plague spread fast and aggressively. He explained that the human body couldn't properly absorb the essence of the world tree. Because of that, the corrupted blood from the Ferdiac victims was extremely hard to treat unless there was an enormous amount of divine power available. That alone explained why the high priests had completely failed to stop the infection. The Empress immediately pointed out the obvious. The founder of the Ferdiac experiment had to be involved. Zelim agreed and added that there was a strong chance they were now following Generva's trail. He also clarified that the trainee priests who allowed the infected high priests into the temple weren't innocent at all. They turned out to be imposters and had already been apprehended. Zelim mentioned that he hadn't told anyone yet, but the Empress calmly replied that secrets like this never stayed buried. Terry then shifted the conversation, asking if there was anyone who didn't know about the sacred ceremony soon to be performed by Elihu as the high priest. Zelim doubted it and asked why that mattered. Terry explained her thinking. If spreading the disease had been the only goal, the culprit could have waited until Elihu was away, since he often left the temple for missions. He countered that maybe the criminal waited for the ceremony on purpose, knowing the crowd would be massive and perfect for spreading the plague. Terry didn't quite buy that. She pointed out that the temple was already packed even on normal days. He was caught off guard by that angle. Terry laughed it off, saying she wasn't claiming she had all the answers. She was just leaving space for other possibilities. But her reasoning didn't go unnoticed. He joked that if Terry ever got tired of being the Emperor's wife, she'd make an excellent advisor. Terry laughed at that and wished him good night, ending the discussion on a lighter note. Later that night, Terry softly called out to the hamster god. She reminded the deity of his promise not to destroy the world and admitted, with a heavy heart, that she felt the end was drawing closer. The god asked what troubled her. Terry confessed she couldn't forget what she had seen in the temple, the desperate cries of people begging her to save them. Semiula told her that remembering those moments was part of her burden. It was the price she had to pay for her past ignorance, as she continued walking the path toward becoming the Divine Maiden. The deity promised to stay by her side. Even so, Terry admitted she wasn't sure she was strong enough. Miu reminded her that she had healed people before. Terry answered that natural disasters were spreading across the world, and she didn't know if she could stop all of them. The god explained that she still didn't fully understand how to control her power, but she was capable of far more than she believed. At the same time, no matter how strong she became, saving the entire continent alone was impossible. Unless she planned to completely tear herself apart, she would need to find a more radical solution. With that heavy truth lingering in the air, Semiula hopped off the bed and casually complained that after eons of absence, his delicate stomach wasn't handling food very well. Declaring that he needed a leisurely walk for his divine digestion, the god wandered off, leaving Terry alone with her thoughts. A few minutes later, Rivenfell finally entered the room, wearing an apologetic look like he'd been detained against his will, which, to be fair, he had. He explained that Zelim had refused to let him leave earlier, going on and on about what an incredibly capable advisor Terry would make. Naturally, he concluded that his wife had once again impressed his advisor with her sharp thinking. Terry brushed it off modestly, saying she had only suggested a few theories and that nothing was fully clear yet. But instead of replying, the Emperor just stared at her. Terry shifted awkwardly under his gaze, unsure what to do with that much attention. Rivenfell finally spoke, saying his wife was so capable that she somehow managed to be useful everywhere she went. He admitted he didn't even know whether he should feel proud or jealous. That comment earned him a confused look. Terry asked what he meant, and he replied that he thought she had already noticed. That was when the mood tilted. Rivenfell said maybe he had restrained his baser instincts more than he should have. If it were up to him, he would have gladly thrown the fate of the world and its people straight into the inferno, and kept Terry's radiant wings clipped safely at his side. The way he leaned closer made it clear he wasn't joking. He gently took her hands and said he was curious how long she planned to keep avoiding saying his name. She immediately reminded him that he was the Emperor. Rivenfell replied that not just anyone could call him that, but she could, because she was his wife. He said softly that she was his first and last wife, and as he spoke, his hair turned silver again. If she refused to call him by name, he added, then perhaps no one else ever would. Terry answered that next time, she would definitely call him that, after she cured him. He pouted, saying he was certain she would banish him from the room the moment the treatment ended. Terry asked if she could kick him out right now. Rivenfell called the Empress cruel. She shot back that she would allow him to return to normal before unleashing any further cruelty, and reminded him that wasting time put him at risk of being seen. Rivenfell kissed her hand instead, assuring her that no one would dare enter the room unless they wanted to die in an especially elegant manner. He then reminded her that they were married now, and complained that she treated Zelim and the high priest better than him, considering she called both of them by name. Terry nervously explained that those two had specifically asked her to address them casually. Rivenfell immediately declared that this was exactly why he demanded the same treatment. Terry muttered that her husband was not a simple man. Rivenfell calmly replied that all the cards in their relationship belonged to her anyway. After all, his strength and power only existed because she continued to heal him. She murmured that she didn't need to be told twice. That was when Rivenfell suddenly asked why she allowed him to kiss her before. Caught off guard, Terry panicked and blurted out that she hadn't decided how she felt about it yet, because she was too busy thinking about the incident at the temple. Rivenfell commented that it sounded like she had forgotten the kiss entirely. Terry quickly denied that and promised to think about it later. He smiled and said he was very patient. Then Terry turned the question back on him and asked why he had kissed her in the first place. Rivenfell warned her that he wasn't sure he could explain it properly and asked for her permission. Right now. She immediately protested, loudly telling him not to do anything like that. Rivenfell begged her not to make him look pitiful for too long and asked her not to be so cruel. Just then the doors burst open. The advisor rushed in, visibly agitated and out of breath. Rivenfell turned sharply, his expression turning icy as he asked if Zelim was seeking death, all while pulling his coat over Terry's shoulders. He ignored the threat and started reporting about the Empire's borders, only to stop mid-sentence when he noticed something was off. Terry reacted instantly, hugging the Emperor to hide his silver hair. A soft glow filled the room, and just like that, his hair turned black again. Rievenfell, now perfectly composed, demanded to know what could possibly justify barging into the royal chambers like that. Zelim explained that someone had crossed the Empire's borders and somehow rendered all the guards unconscious. Rievenfell demanded to know who would dare attack his empire, who would be bold enough to seek war with him. Zelim cut him off, urgently adding that the insolent man was already inside the palace. Worse, the intruder had declared that if he didn't bring Her Majesty to him, he would begin a bloody war. Who could possibly be so desperate to see Terry? Turns out the mystery intruder was none other than Terry's older brother, Prince Karajan himself, who had stormed into the palace, threatening people, and loudly announced that he had come to take his sister back home. The moment Terry saw him, all tension evaporated on her end. She ran straight toward him and threw her arms around him without hesitation. Karajan, despite making a dramatic entrance worthy of a final boss, softened immediately. He hugged her back, calling her his precious little sister, and assuring her that everything would be fine. He even apologized for taking so long to come for her, like he'd just arrived late to pick her up from school instead of invading an empire. Terry asked if he'd been busy dealing with the epidemic back home, and whether it was finally under control. Karajan casually said it was more or less handled. Terry pointed out how wildly underwhelming that answer was, especially considering he had missed her wedding because of it. The prince admitted he had only just learned that she had gotten married at all. The moment he found out, he rushed over without a second thought. Terry understood instantly. Their father had never told him. She told Karajan not to worry, saying she knew he hadn't skipped her wedding on purpose. But his expression didn't soften. Instead, he looked past her, straight at Rievenfell, and declared that this so-called marriage was a farce, and therefore invalid. Right on cue, the waterwolf spirits he had summoned bared their teeth at the Emperor like loyal attack dogs. Terry tried to step in, but Karajan cut her off. He blamed their father for sending her here in the first place, and said he had heard more than enough about the Tyrant Emperor. There was no way he would allow his sister to stay married to a man like that. He admitted he had left her behind earlier because he feared the plague, but seeing her now only confirmed how badly he had failed her. On top of everything else, her late mother had asked him to protect Terry. The prince demanded to know whether the tyrant had dared touch her or threaten her life. Terry denied it immediately, desperate to shut that line of thinking down. That was when Rievenfell stepped forward, wearing a polite smile that didn't quite match the danger in the air. He apologized for interrupting the sibling reunion and suggested they continue the conversation inside the palace, away from prying eyes. From an outside perspective, he noted calmly, it looked very much like the Prince of Ruffian had arrived with hostile intentions. Karajan flatly refused, calling the palace a lion's den. Still smiling, Rievenfell casually observed that Terry's brother was a high-level magician, capable of commanding water spirits. He added that the kingdom of Ruffian should be ashamed for hiding such talent. The compliment somehow sounded more like a provocation. At this point, it became painfully obvious that neither man planned to back down. One side was an overprotective brother with a raging sister complex. On the other was a devoted husband with zero intention of letting his wife be taken away. And no matter how much Terry tried to stop them, the insults and threats kept flying. So she chose violence. Terry marched up to Karajan and slapped him squarely on the back for daring to storm into the imperial palace and pick a fight with the emperor. She didn't stop there. Even the waterwolf spirits got scolded for blindly obeying his every whim, as if they were badly behaved pets. When she turned toward Rievenfell, he immediately crossed his arms over his chest, bracing himself for impact. Instead of slapping him, Terry gently placed her hand on his arm and explained that Karajan was her older brother. She admitted he might be strange, but she knew he only meant well. Rievenfell replied that he understood perfectly, and added that this was the only reason the prince was still alive and breathing. Terry almost swore on the spot. Enough was enough. She declared that serious matters should be handled in the morning. She ordered Rievenfell back to his own bedroom, while she would guide Karajan to her palace instead. She stated firmly that she would have a proper, honest conversation with her brother once everyone had calmed down. As the siblings walked inside, Karajan casually asked whether Terry lived in the Empress's palace. She quickly said no, and explained that her bedchamber was actually near the Emperor's room. She added very firmly that she planned to escort him to his assigned room and then return on her own. She wasn't being kept there. She chose to stay. Her brother said he already understood that much, which caught Terry off guard. She hadn't expected him to accept her decision so easily. The prince remarked that she had never been the obedient type, even as a child. If she had truly hated being sent here as an empress candidate, she would have already plotted some grand escape. The fact that she stayed meant she had a reason. He admitted he hated that she had been sent here by force, and even apologized for her having to remain in a foreign land. Still, he muttered that this fate was far kinder than returning home. Terry assured him that her life here was good. The Emperor, she said, was nothing like the rumors painted him to be. He cared about her, and the people around her treated her well. She never went hungry. She drank tea whenever she wanted. She no longer scrubbed dishes until her hands cracked or froze through the winter. She had warm clothes, clean rooms, and no one barking at her every move. For the first time, she said it plainly. She liked it here. Karajan admitted the palace was impressive. He'd noticed that long ago, back when he was still a boy. That comment made Terry pause. She asked if he had visited the empire before. He looked surprised she didn't remember. He explained that both imperial and royal families had gathered here once for continental peace talks. Concubines were excluded, but the children were present. Terry had been there with him. Back then, she cried nonstop and begged not to be left alone. Karajan also recalled feeling annoyed when she returned late one night after secretly running off to play with other kids. As the heir, he had lived in the palace with their father, while the rest of the family stayed comfortably in a townhouse. Terry, however, refused to be separated from him. She clung to his side and complained endlessly until she was allowed to stay too. Terry was stunned. She couldn't remember any of it. The prince suggested it was because she had been sick for a long time back then, and had always been forgetful as a child. By then, Terry felt relieved. Her brother had finally calmed down. She only hoped her husband had done the same, because she knew she would need to speak with him alone soon. She told Karajan he could stay in the room. Before leaving, she sternly warned him never to barge in unannounced again, especially not while summoning magical spirits inside the imperial palace. Karajan said there was something he needed to tell her. She cut him off immediately, and stated that she would not divorce the emperor. She understood his worry and his need to protect her, but things were not as terrifying as he imagined. He hesitated, then quietly asked whether the emperor knew her secret. Terry's eyes widened. The realization hit her hard. Her brother had known all along that she was the Divine Maiden of the prophecy. Before anything else could be said, the scene shifted to the emperor's office, where Zelim was confronting his master about his secret. Rivenfell admitted he didn't know exactly when things had started to spiral. He could only guess when it began. Zelim reacted with open shock, demanding to know why he hadn't been told earlier. He insisted that he cared about the emperor and should have known. Rivenfell replied calmly that if the entire continent turned against him, Zelim's knowledge would doom them both. Rivenfell then asked what would happen now. Would Zelim expose him? Did he want something in return? Wealth, power, glory? He invited his advisor to name his price. The advisor realized then that Rivenfell wasn't denying anything, and Rivenfell didn't bother to. He said there was no point pretending. Zelim was smart enough to see the truth. He told him he was free to act however he wished, but asked him to listen first. Rivenfell explained that Terry knew nothing about his condition. If someone had to be blamed, if someone had to die for it, then it should be him alone. All of it was for the sake of one person more precious to him than anyone else. One life he valued more than his own. He was prepared to do anything. Zelim clenched his fists. Something felt deeply off. The cold, ruthless emperor he knew didn't match the man standing before him, ready to burn himself for the sake of someone so fragile. And yet suddenly, everything made sense. He understood why the Empress had asked him about the Ferdiac experiment. He had answered logically, dismissively, because it meant nothing to him, an atrocity from a bygone era. He hadn't realized that its sole surviving victim had been standing right in front of him all along. He admitted that ignorance was his own fault. when he asked if the seal's mark could still be hidden beneath Rivenfell's clothes. Rivenfell replied that the real problem was only his hair color. As long as Terry was near him, everything stayed under control. Zelium let out a slow sigh. If this was his master's choice, then all he could do was prepare for the day Her Majesty might no longer be there. Another plan would be needed. Still, he said that if Rivenfell was willing to expose his back to protect such a delicate flower, then he would stand with him. He would become the Emperor's accomplice and keep the secret. He added that for the sake of his loyalty, he was ready to help the Emperor all the way. Next morning, Phoebe walks in, all cheerful and ready to greet Terry, but the smile drops instantly. The Empress looks completely wrecked. Dark circles, tired eyes, the kind of face that says she did not sleep and absolutely did not have a peaceful night. And to understand why, the story quietly rewinds to the night before. That was when her brother asked if the Emperor already knew about her secret. He admitted he had acted clueless until the very end, but truthfully, he'd always suspected things would reach this point. If Terry really became Empress, there was no way she could hide something like that forever. And worse, he wasn't sure she'd survive what followed once the truth came out. Terry didn't know how to respond. She tried to think carefully, but she knew her brother well. Once he believed something, no amount of gentle explaining would move him. Trying to calm her, the prince told her not to panic. No one else knew, just him. Then he asked the question she wasn't ready to hear. Did she really trust the Emperor? And wasn't it dangerous that someone like him knew about her power? That was where Terry hit her limit. Instead of answering, she turned around and ran, just flat out fled, leaving Karajan calling her name behind her. Now Terry stands quietly while maids help her dress, replaying everything in her head, and mentally scolding herself for running away. She knows she should have said something, but at that moment, she genuinely didn't know what to do. If only Semiula were around, he might have given her some advice. Unfortunately, the god is nowhere to be found, and Terry has no idea when, or if, he will return. She snaps out of her thoughts when she notices her maids practically glowing with excitement. Their eyes are sparkling like they're holding juicy gossip, and of course, Terry asks why. Apparently, word has spread that the Empress's brother arrived at the palace last night. And not only that, he's incredibly handsome. Terry can't help thinking that even back home, Karajan never lacked admirers. One maid goes further, saying the prince could easily rival Lord Raven. That gets Terry's attention. Curious, she asks who that is. The maid explains that Raven is the second son of the Marquise, and he's devilishly charming. So charming, in fact, that countless women have lost sleep thinking about him. His red hair is said to spark love like fire. His blue eyes resemble heavenly lakes. And when he smiles, people forget how to breathe. However, everyone agrees on one thing. His father is terrifying. A complete opposite of Raven. Another maid adds that Raven takes after his late mother more than his father. Soft, gentle, almost cloud-like. That's why women constantly surround him. Yet he never commits to anyone, treating everyone kindly but keeping his distance. Then another one chimes in with her own opinion, saying she personally finds the high priest more attractive. If you want to feel close to the gods, just look at his face, and heaven comes to you. This is Terry's first real girl talk, and she surprisingly doesn't hate it. Feeling brave, she joins in. She asks if they wouldn't agree that the Emperor is the most handsome of all. Every maid stiffens before responding together in perfectly timed agreement, praising His Majesty with voices that sound more rehearsed than sincere. Terry notices, and she is not pleased. She genuinely thinks her husband is impressive, tall, striking, strong, with a powerful presence. He's wealthy, influential, and despite rumors, kind. It suddenly hits her that people might fear him simply because of gossip. After all, before meeting him, she had been afraid too. And as his wife, she feels obligated to defend him. So, she explains that while his sharp features may make him seem rude, he's actually gentle and caring. His height and broad shoulders might intimidate people, but that's just because he's strong. There's nothing frightening about him at all. Suddenly a voice is heard behind her. What a lucky man I am to have such a doting wife. Rivenfell is standing there smiling brightly. The maids immediately bow so deeply they might hit the floor. The Emperor tells them that sharing information with the Empress is fine, but he coldly asked them not to exaggerate, especially when discussing the beauty of Raven or the High Priest. The maids panic, apologize profusely, and promise never to do it again. He dismisses them, asking for privacy. Once they're alone, Terry swallows hard. If he heard the part about Raven, then he definitely heard everything else too. He grins and teasingly asks if she truly thinks he's handsome, suggesting they discuss it in more detail. Terry quickly shuts that down, saying they can talk later. There are more important things. He pretends to think, joking that perhaps those important things involve how impressive his shoulders are. She blushes instantly, remembering her earlier praise, and tells him to stop teasing. She confirms she meant everything she said, but insists they talk about Zelim instead. The Emperor explains that his advisor now knows everything. Terry is shocked and asks if he even tried to hide it. Rivenfell doubts his advisor would have believed a lie anyway. He's known the man too long. Terry assumes Zelim must have sworn secrecy. Otherwise, she reasons, the Emperor would have killed him, and clearly Zelim is still alive. Her husband reminds her that she just described him as kind and caring. Then he asks about her conversation with her brother. That's exactly what she wanted to discuss. Terry asks him to lean closer, and whispers into his ear that Karajan already knows she's the Divine Maiden incarnate. Rivenfell looks genuinely surprised, and leans in even closer. And unfortunately for Terry, that sudden closeness makes her eyes drift, right to his lips, which suddenly look far too inviting for a kiss. Out of nowhere, a surge of water shot straight up, scooped Terry off her feet, and plopped her neatly onto the back of a waterwolf spirit. Her brother completely lost it. He demanded to know how the two of them dared get so close, accusing them of locking lips right in front of him. Broad daylight, no less. Apparently, that was the real crime here. Rivenfell, of course, found this deeply amusing. He let out a light chuckle, and wondered aloud whether the prince thought it would somehow be more acceptable after sunset. That was it. Terry snapped internally and directed most of her frustration straight at her husband. Once again, the two men squared off, tension thick enough to trip over, both looking ready to start another round of posturing. Completely done with this nonsense, Terry shouted an order at the waterwolf to bite them both, even though she knew perfectly well it wasn't an attack dog. At that point, logic had left the room along with her patience. She shut her eyes, exhausted down to her bones, wishing this day would just fast forward to tomorrow. Thankfully, salvation arrived earlier in the form of Zelim. The advisor appeared at the last possible second, grabbed the Emperor, and dragged him aside to deliver a low but furious lecture about behaving like a child in front of foreign royalty. He then announced that urgent matters required His Majesty's immediate attention and wasted no time escorting him away. That only left Terry with one unresolved problem, her brother. Karajan didn't miss his chance. He reminded her that she had run away outright last night and asked if he could finally hear her answer. Terry trembled. Her mind went blank, and not a single convincing lie came to her. And then, as if summoned by sheer desperation, help arrived in the most unexpected way. A warm, cheerful voice echoed through the room. The High Priest appeared, greeting her as if this was a perfectly normal morning visit. When Terry asked what brought him so early, he vaguely replied that he had brought something she'd been searching for. In his hands was Teriella. The hamster god was absolutely furious, loudly complaining about broken snack promises, betrayal, and being forcibly dragged back. While Teriella ranted, Terry gently cupped him in her hands as Elihu excitedly explained how he'd found him. Terry thanked him with genuine relief. In her mind, this was a miracle wrapped in fur. She immediately told her brother she needed to take care of the hamster and announced she was leaving. Karajan protested, telling her to wait, but she was already walking away at a speed that suggested waiting was no longer an option. Watching her retreat, Teriella glanced at the prince and thought to himself that this stubborn child truly insisted on walking paths laid out by no one but fate. Tragic human indeed. Later that night, Terry sat alone in her room, turning the problem over and over in her head. No matter how hard she thought, no solution came. Lost in thought, she didn't notice when Rivenfell entered the room. He studied her and remarked that every worry she had was written plainly on her face. He guessed she was still troubled by what she had told him earlier. She admitted it, explaining that she had run away before she and her brother could actually talk. Rivenfell leaned closer, and casually suggested that they could put their heads together to solve it. Or if she preferred, their lips too. Terry turned bright red. Completely flustered, she hurriedly clarified that was not what she meant. She needed his wit, not his teasing, to come up with a story convincing enough to fool her brother. The Emperor laughed, clearly enjoying himself. That only irritated her more. He always twisted everything into a joke. Then his expression shifted. Rievenfell grew serious and said it seemed to him that Karajan already knew about her powers. He suggested it might be simpler to tell the prince that his sister was merely treating him. Terry admitted that would be easier. Hearing that, Rievenfell assumed she had already told her brother everything. She shut that down immediately. Without his consent, she would never reveal his secret. Rievenfell answered softly that he was touched. Terry couldn't help wondering what kind of life he must have lived to be surprised by something like that. Rievenfell stood and said that if his wife treated him with such care, then he would respond in kind. He held out his hand and asked her to come with him. But the problem? It's almost midnight. The moment the two stepped into Karajan's room, he immediately demanded to know exactly what was going on. Terry pointed out that it was almost midnight, and maybe this conversation could wait until daylight. Rievenfell, however, looked completely unbothered. He reminded her that he had promised to handle everything himself, and he had no intention of backing out now. Seeing how casually the Emperor held his sister's hand left Karajan flushed and visibly shaken. Then Rievenfell casually began unbuttoning his shirt. Rievenfell commented that it was hard for his wife to hide anything from him, especially when she worried this much. As his shirt came open, a mark appeared on his chest, right above his heart. Calmly, he revealed that he already knew about Terry's power. Karajan froze. After a long pause, he nodded, finally piecing everything together. Rievenfell explained that he was a survivor of the Ferdiac experiment. As he spoke, his hair shifted back to silver, as if proving his words. He even remarked that people would probably find it entertaining if the truth ever came out. Terry, meanwhile, stood there stunned. She hadn't expected her husband to reveal this much so openly. Rievenfell reached out and called her to him. Remembering his promise, Terry decided to trust him. She placed her hands against his bare chest, and almost instantly, his silver hair darkened again. The prince snapped, demanding to know what this display was supposed to mean. Rievenfell answered without hesitation. He said he would never harm his wife. As long as she stayed by his side, she would never be in danger. Her life and health mattered more to him than his own. He went on to explain that he understood exactly what it meant to have a sister like Terry. If news of a saintess ever spread, war would break out immediately. At first, people would worship her. Then they would cage her, control her, and strip her freedom away. She would become a test subject, just like the World Tree, a container for divine power. Karajan asked the obvious question, would Rievenfell do the same? Rievenfell answered calmly that if he ever truly wanted to, he would have already broken her legs, locked her away, and made sure no one else could reach her. He added that if he wished, this reunion would never have happened at all. He stated plainly that there was no safer place for Teriella than his palace. He admitted that he needed her divine power as well, and that was exactly why he swore to protect both her and her secret. Turning to her, he smiled and said he would use all his authority for her sake alone. Karajan, however, stayed silent. He still wasn't fully convinced. That was when the Emperor added one final condition. If he ever harmed his wife, Karajan was free to expose his secret to the entire continent. The prince turned to his sister and asked if she agreed with this arrangement. She nodded, and then asked him how long he had known about her power. He told her it began when she had once fallen down the stairs and healed almost instantly. She barely remembered it. As a child, she had fallen countless times. Karajan explained that after that day, he watched her closely. Others in the palace either didn't notice or chose to look away. One day, he saw her sitting alone, crying over an injured leg. Moments later, the wound disappeared. She then wrapped the uninjured leg in bandages to hide it. Terry was shocked. She asked why he had never said anything. Her brother answered simply that since she had chosen to hide it, he respected her decision. He admitted that he felt ashamed for keeping this from her all these years. Then, placing a hand firmly on her shoulder, he gave her one final piece of advice. She was not to sleep with the Emperor. Immediately after, he turned to Rievenfell and warned him that if he ever hurt his sister, he would tear his head off. Peace, as usual, did not last long. Watching them, Terry couldn't help noticing how similar the two men actually were. Soon after, Karajan announced that he would be returning to their kingdom. Terry was surprised, having expected him to stay longer. He explained that his visit was unofficial and that urgent matters awaited him back home. As Rievenfell buttoned his shirt, he made an offer. He suggested employing Karajan to investigate the alchemist. The prince asked why he should agree. His Majesty only replied that the matter needed to be resolved quickly. Eventually, Karajan said he wouldn't actively search for the alchemist, but he didn't refuse outright either. When Terry asked him to stay a little longer, Rievenfell stepped in smoothly and explained that a sacred ceremony would take place soon. After that, Karajan would be free to leave. He added that heaven itself would bless all who attended. The night of the sacred ceremony finally arrived. People poured in from every corner of the empire, filling the temple grounds until there was barely room to breathe. Standing beside the imperial couple, the high priest looked genuinely overwhelmed. Glancing at the endless crowd, he admitted that none of this would have happened without the Empress. Terry immediately waved that idea away. She said she hadn't done anything special, and insisted the credit belonged to him instead. Elihu spoke softly then, saying that thanks to the Empress, many had already felt Semiola's presence. After bowing deeply to both Terry and Rievenfell, he announced that the ceremony would now begin. As silence slowly settled, Elihu stood tall and raised his silver staff. Divine light spiraled upward, wrapping around him in soft, glowing arcs that made the entire temple seem unreal. Rievenfell leaned closer to his wife and whispered that this was actually the first ceremony he had ever attended. He confessed that he had always been afraid of going out at night. Over the years, he had invented an impressive number of excuses just to avoid events like this. His cheeks turned pink as he spoke, and then he added more softly that he was grateful now, because this time, he has Terry by his side. That single sentence was enough to warm Terry's cheeks. Even the hamster god perched on her shoulder seemed to pause, as if briefly struck by sympathy. He then lifted one tiny paw toward the sky and snapped his fingers. Without warning, the night exploded into color. Fireworks bloomed across the night sky. The crowd gasped as one, heads tilting upward in awe. People whispered that the god Semiola himself had descended to bless them. The high priest stared skyward, tears streaming freely as he declared that the god had truly answered their prayers. Terry leaned slightly toward Semiola and asked in a low voice if that hadn't been a bit much. The fluffy god puffed out his chest proudly and said he hadn't even broken a sweat. With sparkling eyes, he added that he hadn't healed anyone or saved lives. He had simply given people beautiful dreams for the night. At the same time, deep inside a dark dungeon, a priest screamed that he would confess everything. His voice trembled as he shouted that the plague outbreak at the Great Temple was meant to force all imperial forces into containment mode, pulling guards, servants, and officials away while chaos spread across the nation. Zelim watched him with cold, unmoving eyes and asked what he hoped to gain by causing such disorder. The priest stammered, barely able to hold himself together, and confessed that it was Generva's plan. The chaos was meant to allow the alchemist to sneak into the capital unnoticed. Whatever Generva was planning next, it was clear the plague was only the beginning.